So imagine, just for the sake of argument, that you're a regular user of a specific rule system. Doesn't matter which one exactly, but you're familiar with it. You like it. Your players know how to make use of it for skill checks, combat operations and similar things. And now imagine, as does happen from time to time, that your group has become enthralled with a particular story that's currently on TV or movies or video games, or for the old school among us, carefully hidden in books. It's possible, certainly, that the owners of the original story, or the IP in text speak, have licensed someone to create a tabletop RPG set in that universe, but not always. And I also have to mention that just because a game is official, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's actually good. Even if it is technically a very fine game, it doesn't mean it will appeal to your players. And even more relevant, what happens if you really only want to do a quick one-shot? I mean, do you really have to invest in new rules and then invest the time necessary to get everyone familiar with them before you can play a narrative that might last just a few hours of table time? The answer, naturally, is no. And don't think I haven't spotted you in chat having a go at my hatred of D10s. I have. The answer, naturally, is no. Of course you don't. You absolutely can play the official game, if one exists. But you aren't required to. This is role-playing. You can do whatever you want. So, we should look at the nature of published RPGs to see how they deal with this sort of thing internally, and then it's easy to work out if there's a way to bolt on the relevant rules you need to cope with the new setting. Yes, I'm afraid my camera appears to have gone on strike. I don't know exactly why, and I can't really work it out while I'm streaming. Apologies. I genuinely do apologise. The story begins, as all TTRPG stories do, with TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. D&D had developed through some real-world play between some actual people. As they tweaked and adapted it, they'd made concessions to a number of different variations on the theme of fantasy gaming. And I suspect, though I don't actually know this for a fact, that as different collections of environments and monsters and spells were added, their original intent was for the players to pick the subgenre and then populate it according to their choice. In other words, I think the idea was that trolls and ogres and goblins were intended to be used principally if your setting was high medieval European fantasy. If you wanted to do something more, shall we say, Aladdin-y, then you'd pick genies and rocks. If you were thinking Greek mythology, then minotaurs, hydras and the sort would naturally hove into view. Of course, if this was the intention, it fell at the first hurdle, because GMs happily took whatever they thought was most interesting and put it in the game they were currently running. In any event, D&D was particularly poorly suited to any genre that wasn't essentially swords and sorcery. TSR made a number of gallant attempts to adapt the rules to suit other genres, of course, and these offerings mostly fell rather flat. Things were slightly more promising for Traveller. The skill-based system and the way it already handled everything from stone clubs to plasma guns was definitely a benefit, but it had no easy mechanic defined that could be adapted to supernatural elements apart from psionics, and those were deliberately very limited in scope. But there was a third way, and it was called RuneQuest. RuneQuest was interesting in a number of ways. It was probably the first RPG to really embrace quality art and presentation in its materials, and it was the first major system to use percentile rolls for achieving objectives. At least it's the one I blame for that. To this day, it's possible to see elements of RuneQuest in games like Call of Cthulhu, for those familiar with those rules. But RuneQuest isn't actually the point here. The point is something else. Something called basic role-playing. Basic role-playing, or BRP, was a slim, unimposing booklet that was included in the boxed starter set for RuneQuest, beginning with the second edition. It was, fundamentally, the core system mechanics of RuneQuest, but with all the universe-specific stuff stripped out. It used a completely skill-based system for character progression, and it was released in 1980. Why is it important? Because the concept was that you could use these rules to put the structure behind any game you wanted to run. It was a novel idea and far ahead of its time, and as you can imagine, it took the RPG world by nothing at all. Nobody really noticed, and those that did just used it as a basic set of rules for RuneQuest. Which is a shame, because at the time there really weren't a lot of mechanics suited to this sort of adaptation. There's a link on the screen for if you want to go and get a copy of it today. It's still being offered for people to play through, and it's still a workable system. So some years later, in about 1986, Steve Jackson released a system called GURPS, the Generic Universal Role-Playing System, and everyone thought it was a completely new idea, because that's just how life works. GURPS was, to be fair, a bit different in concept. Where BRP had given you a skeleton, but relied on you to put all the flesh on it, GURPS gave you a skeleton and then provided you with sourcebooks to adapt that into the genre of your dreams. It was an enormous success. Or, well, it was an enormous commercial success at least, because it sold the rules in increments. If you wanted to play a fantasy setting, then you bought the rules, then the magic rules, then the monster rules, then the advanced magic rules, then the specific rules for GURPS fantasy setting. Okay, I mean, I'm exaggerating somewhat, but there were 7.3 gigazillion GURPS books. 7.3 gigazillion. And that's not an exaggeration, that's simple fact. The system was actually great fun, and pretty simple. But unless you had a regular group of players who were comfortable with a locally written set of rules, you could end up in a very shouty environment, especially if the setting you wanted to play had an official GURPS rulebook already. And many did. GURPS ended up licensing a huge number of properties. Thankfully, there's also a light version of these rules available for free. Link on the screen. So moving on, we've come to the modern era of licensed game systems, and it's time to talk Unisystem. Unisystem is by no means the only example of the more modern type, but it's the best example, for reasons that will become clear. Partly, in fact, because it went through two distinct phases, and those represent a shift in how these kind of settings were handled. But there's another better reason to come. So, to quickly recap, the idea of the generic rule set started with a basic system and relied on you to do all the work, like BRP. Then later there was a basic system, but they'd sell you modules for it that would do much of that work for you, like GURPS. Unisystem is a good example of the third phase of this sort of thing. Unisystem rules were a generic system, but they weren't sold as a generic system. Not really. Instead, they were sold as a complete game that just happened to use a generic rule set underneath. That mechanic was irrelevant and arguably invisible to the players, unless they happened to have played multiple games using the same basic underlying rules and could spot the connection. In other words, we're back to where we started, with games that were complete settings and rules in one, except that this time the underlying mechanics were designed to be suitable for use in many genres. Now, depending on which source you believe, the very first Unisystem game was either Witchcraft or Armageddon, and as those names suggest, it was a system that adapted well to different settings. Later, it was somewhat streamlined as a system and turned into a more cinematic style, a version of the rules referred to as cinematic rules, because it was more cinematic. The first game released under this form was the Buffy the Vampire Slayer RPG, which is why I went for Unisystem as my example. Unisystem is a good system by any measure. Fairly quick and allowing plenty of scope for role-playing, and taking any of the games and adapting the mechanics for your own home games is both easy and fast. It's just weird that this, arguably the best of the generic systems, was never sold as such, and relies on you understanding the mechanics pretty well to make the right choices. Of course, Unisystem isn't perfect. Far from it. It uses D10s. So, back to the original question. How on earth do you make the game do what you need it to do? How do you adapt the mechanics into the setting you want to play? Well, we'll do quite a lot more on that next time, but just to get you started, I have a few guidelines. First, you have to know the setting's mechanics very well. I don't mean you can quote all the lines from the movie. I mean you've understood the rules of the universe well enough to predict the way things work in the future. Second, you have to have a deep understanding of the way the setting's narratives are structured in tone and plot. You need to really appreciate the extent to which the stories either cover ordinary people doing extraordinary things, or the remarkably gifted doing what comes naturally to them. Third, you have to convert all of that information into appropriately balanced elements that allow players to make choices that would work in the original universe, and discover that these choices are also wise in the game. And finally, you have to map these balances onto the system's underlying mechanics so that things are appropriately hard or easy, likely or unlikely. If all that sounds hard, believe me, I know. And if you think it might prove very difficult to execute this sleight of hand with panache, then I'm right with you. Even more relevant, this is the challenge when the rules you're using are fairly generic in nature. I promise you it's much harder to use more specialised rules and adapt them to a new setting. But there are a few things that might help. Many stories are lavishly supported with books, websites and behind-the-scenes stuff. If they've published the actual capabilities of a starship that's only been seen as a narrative device in the story, then lean heavily on that. Another thing that might help is the inclusion of a heroic mechanic, like the one used in the cinematic form of Unisystem. Essentially, this is a rule breaker, a critical success, a moment of exhilarating excess, brushing past the mere limitations of reality. It's how you carry the day with aplomb, provided you haven't wasted those opportunities on trivialities before the decisive moment. If that sounds like a terrible idea for any attempt to be faithful to the setting, I would suggest that you must first be faithful to the narrative. Players want to be heroes, not spectators. It also has the advantage of papering over any cracks you've left in your careful adaptation of the rules, because if you've missed something, overlooked something, and when a player suggests it at the table you think, I should definitely have included a way for that to happen, then you say, be heroic with it. Be cinematic with it. Roll a big die. Possibly a D20. Next time I'm planning to go through an example of how to do this kind of process, but for now at least I've covered some of the sort of approaches that professional systems took to this in the past, which I hope will be a little bit helpful and not too off-putting, and encourage you to have a go at such a thing yourself. In fact, I've got one coming up in the next few weeks. I've written a game system to take a specific genre of historical time and place to turn into a game. So we will see. We'll see if I've done it well. So that's it for this time. Many thanks once again for joining me. I hope you found it entertaining despite the camera troubles. Tomorrow night is Traveller, our ongoing campaign, as our heroes battle their own morals as they find out just what they'll be willing to do to save a friend. On Saturday we're taking a break from gaming for an evening. We're going out on our works outing in town, with food and drinks generously supplied by our wonderful subscribers. please allow me to express our ongoing sense of shock that anybody would support us in this way, and our heartfelt gratitude for doing so. It turns out that free beer is a really wonderful gift. Are we the first people to discover this amazing fact? I think we'll try to put something of a tour of the town on the stream as we drunkenly get lost on the way back to the pub, hopefully. And on Sunday, Luke plays a brand new Spooky Sunday game, which seems to tick our science fiction, narrative and general peril boxes quite elegantly. It's called Deliver Us the Moon, and I'm really looking forward to it. Speaking of upcoming things, I think there are still 1 or 2 seats available in upcoming one-shots over the next month or two. If you're willing to expose yourself to our, frankly, experimental sense of humour and are interested in a game, please feel free to let us know. We're planning to try and do these advanced blocks going forward, so if none of these ones interest you or don't fit your schedule, then please do keep an eye out for the next group, because you never know, there may be something that grabs you by the throat and won't let go. Possibly like a sand crate. So, until next time, I will... I'll see you online, hopefully with my camera working tomorrow evening as part of our Traveller stream. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along and chatting in chat, and completely failing to be sympathetic about my hatred of D10s and, generally speaking, percentile rolls. I feel that, truthfully, I needed your support here, and I didn't feel I got it entirely. Mostly from Luke. But... yes, bear sounds, definitely. There is actually, we should show them the bear on Saturday. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you had some fun, and I wish you a very, very good night. Sorry, Sparrow. I didn't actually mean you to feel genuinely guilty about something as disastrously daft as this. Good night, all.